In the final months of the war, as the map of Europe collapsed inward on itself, Adolf Hitler stopped trusting the maps entirely. Pins were no longer moved with confidence. Red arrows were drawn, erased, and drawn again. Intelligence briefings arrived late, contradictory, often already obsolete. And yet, in the underground rooms of the Führerbunker, one name kept resurfacing with a persistence that even Hitler could not ignore. It was not Eisenhower, not Montgomery, not even Stalin. It was Patton, George S. Patton, an American general who, on paper, should not have unsettled the German high command, but in reality had become something far more dangerous, unpredictable, fast, and psychologically disruptive. By early 1945, Hitler no longer spoke about Patton the way he once did. Gone was the dismissive tone reserved for what he called the soft American army. Gone were the assumptions that U.S. commanders were cautious, slow, dependent on overwhelming material rather than instinct. In private conferences, away from the microphones, away from propaganda officers, away from the rigid optimism demanded by the regime, Hitler began framing Patton differently. Not as a mere enemy general, but as a problem. A problem Germany had failed to solve. What made Patton so unsettling was not just his victories. German generals had seen victories before. What disturbed them, and increasingly disturbed Hitler, was the speed at which Patton appeared, vanished, and reappeared somewhere else entirely. Reports would come in from the front describing American armored units striking positions German intelligence believed were secure for days. Sometimes weeks. In more than one instance, field commanders reported being attacked by forces they were assured were still hundreds of kilometers away. At first, Hitler accused his generals of incompetence. Then exaggeration. Then sabotage. But gradually, he began to notice the pattern. Patton did not behave like other Allied commanders. He did not wait for perfect supply lines. He did not pause for ceremonial coordination. He did not ask permission in the way German planners expected. He moved as if war were a fluid state, not a sequence of stages. And that violated everything the German General Staff believed about how Americans fought. Inside late-night briefings, Hitler's language shifted. He stopped asking where Patton was and began asking where Patton could be next. That change alone terrified his staff. Because it meant Hitler was no longer reacting, he was anticipating. And anticipation meant fear. According to notes taken by officers present in these conferences, Hitler described Patton as a man who attacks the mind before the position. He warned that Patton's greatest weapon was not tanks or artillery, but tempo. He does not give you time to recover, Hitler reportedly said. He does not let you stabilize. For a leader obsessed with control, Patton represented chaos in its purest form. German generals who had faced Patton in North Africa and Sicily recognized the danger immediately. They tried to explain it in language Hitler would understand. Patton, they said, treated warfare as momentum. Once moving, he refused to stop. He believed hesitation killed more soldiers than aggression. This mindset made him dangerous not only tactically, but psychologically. Units facing Patton often believed they were being attacked by larger forces than actually existed. Panic spread faster than truth. And once panic took hold, Patton was already gone, pushing deeper, faster, leaving shattered formations behind him. By late 1944, after the Ardennes offensive collapsed and German hopes of dividing the Allies evaporated, Hitler's focus on Patton intensified. During internal discussions about where the Americans would strike next, Hitler interrupted his staff repeatedly to ask the same question: where is Patton? Not Eisenhower. Not Bradley. Patton. When told Patton was repositioning, Hitler reportedly snapped, "Then he is preparing to move." When told Patton was resting, Hitler replied, "Then he is preparing to deceive." It was no longer paranoia. It was an experience. The irony was brutal. Hitler had once admired commanders who embodied aggression and speed. He had built his early victories on exactly those principles. Blitzkrieg had been his obsession. But now, in Patton, he was facing an enemy who understood those principles just as well, perhaps better. and applied them without ideological rigidity. Patton did not need to justify movement through doctrine. He simply moved. As Germany's military situation deteriorated, Hitler began issuing increasingly specific orders regarding Patton. Entire defensive plans were altered not based on Allied strength, but on Patton's potential involvement. Units were instructed to prepare for sudden breakthroughs even when intelligence suggested no immediate threat. Reserves were held back, not for Eisenhower's main push, but for Patton's unpredictable thrusts. In effect, Hitler allowed one American general to distort the entire German defensive posture. And that distortion came at a cost. By diverting attention and resources toward Patton, Hitler weakened other fronts. But he could not stop himself. In Patton, he saw something he recognized from his own past victories: initiative. And initiative, once lost, was almost impossible to regain. In one of the last recorded conferences before the bunker descended into isolation, Hitler reportedly addressed his generals with an unusually blunt assessment. He said that Patton was not winning because of superior numbers alone. He was winning because he acted as if time belonged to him, and not to Germany. He fights tomorrow today, Hitler said. And today, we are always too late. For a man who had built his empire on speed, that admission was devastating. And yet, even as Hitler recognized Patton's danger, he refused to fully adapt. Orders remained rigid. The movement required approval. Initiative was punished if it deviated from plan. Hitler understood the problem, but he could no longer change himself. Patton represented not just an enemy general, but a mirror. One that reflected what Germany had once been, and what it no longer was. As the war entered its final phase, Hitler's fixation on Patton would grow darker, more personal, and more fatal. Because what Hitler told his generals next was not analysis. It was a warning. By the spring of 1945, Adolf Hitler no longer spoke about victory. Not in private. Not even in the carefully filtered language of internal briefings. The word had become theoretical, something discussed the way one discusses weather patterns that will never arrive. Instead, Hitler spoke in terms of delay, of disruption, of buying time. And increasingly, in those last meetings with his remaining generals, one subject returned again and again: how long Patton could be slowed. What Hitler told them was chillingly direct. He warned that if Patton reached certain objectives before German forces could reorganize, entire fronts would unravel, not gradually, but instantly. He did not describe Patton as a conventional threat. He described him as a chain reaction. A single breach created panic, panic created collapse, collapse created speed, and speed destroyed everything behind it. German intelligence officers tried to reassure him. They cited fuel shortages, overextended supply lines, the idea that Patton was finally outrunning his logistics. Hitler dismissed them. He had heard the same arguments before, right before Patton appeared somewhere he could not possibly be. What terrified Hitler most was that Patton did not behave like a man who feared mistakes. German command culture had become paralyzed by fear of failure. Every movement required justification. Every deviation demanded approval. Patton operated in the opposite psychological universe. He moved first, justified later, and treated confusion as a weapon rather than a liability. In one of the last extended conferences before communication began breaking down entirely, Hitler addressed a room filled with exhausted generals, men who had spent years trying to impose order on chaos. He told them that Patton was dangerous precisely because he did not wait for clarity. He advances while others calculate, Hitler said. And by the time calculations are complete, he is already behind you. This was not hyperbole. German field reports from France and the Western Front repeatedly described units being outflanked not through superior planning, but through relentless forward motion. Patton exploited hesitation the way a predator exploits weakness. He sensed pauses. He sensed doubt. And he attacked the moment it appeared. Hitler's instructions became increasingly obsessive. He ordered his generals to treat any lull in Patton's movement as a deception, any pause as preparation, any quiet sector as a potential breakthrough point. This paranoia forced German units to spread thinner, hold more ground with fewer men, and react to shadows rather than confirmed threats. The result was strategic exhaustion. Patton, whether intentionally or not, had forced Germany into a defensive posture it could not sustain. By simply existing as a possibility, by being capable of rapid movement, he compelled Hitler to defend everywhere at once. And then there was the psychological dimension. Hitler told his generals that Patton understood something the Germans had forgotten. War was not only about destroying forces, it was about destroying belief. Units facing Patton often lost confidence before the first tank arrived. Rumors traveled faster than orders. Retreats began before contact. Officers hesitated, unsure whether holding ground meant survival or annihilation. This was not accidental. Patton cultivated reputation the way others cultivated logistics. His language was theatrical. His movements were exaggerated. His speed became legend. And legends, Hitler understood, could kill armies without firing a shot. In private, Hitler compared Patton unfavorably to Montgomery, a comparison that revealed more than he intended. Montgomery, Hitler believed, was methodical, predictable, cautious. Dangerous, yes, but slow. Patton was the opposite. He violated German expectations at every level. He did not respect defensive lines. He did not honor pauses. He did not behave as German doctrine said Americans should. That unpredictability forced Hitler into constant reaction. And reaction, in late-war Germany, was fatal. As Allied forces closed in from both east and west, Hitler became convinced that Patton's true objective was psychological decapitation, breaking German morale faster than the Red Army could crush it physically. He warned his generals that Patton's advances would trigger mass surrenders, civilian panic, and internal collapse if not checked immediately. What made this especially painful was that Hitler recognized Patton's strategy because it mirrored his own early campaigns. Fast movement. Shock. Refusal to let the enemy stabilize. But unlike Hitler, Patton did not micromanage from a bunker. He trusted subordinate commanders. He allowed initiative. He accepted the risk. And Germany, by 1945, could not. Hitler's final warnings about Patton were not tactical, they were philosophical. He told his generals that Patton represented a form of warfare Germany no longer knew how to fight. One built on confidence rather than fear, on momentum rather than permission, on action rather than ideology. In one particularly stark moment, Hitler reportedly said that Patton did not need to defeat Germany militarily to win. He only needed to keep moving. Because every mile Patton advanced without resistance proved that German command no longer controlled events. And control was everything to Hitler. As the bunker grew quieter, as reports became fewer and more fragmented, Hitler continued asking about Patton even when other fronts demanded attention. His generals noticed it. They whispered about it. Patton had become not just an enemy general, but a symbol of what Germany could no longer stop. By the time Hitler realized that Patton could not be contained, not by orders, not by fear, not by doctrine, it was too late. The damage was already done. Because what Hitler told his generals next was no longer a warning. It was a resignation. By April 1945, Hitler's conversations about Patton no longer sounded like strategy sessions. They sounded like post-mortems delivered before death. The tone had changed. The urgency was gone. What remained was analysis, cold, bitter, and strangely lucid. Hitler was no longer asking how to stop Patton. He was trying to understand why Patton had worked when so many others had failed. In one of the final briefings attended by what remained of the German High Command, Hitler admitted something he had never acknowledged publicly. Germany had prepared to fight an enemy that no longer existed. He said the Wehrmacht had trained to confront doctrine, not temperament. And Patton, he insisted, was temperament made flesh. He told his generals that Patton didn't defeat Germany by superior firepower. The Allies had more of everything, tanks, fuel, aircraft, but those advantages alone did not explain the collapse. What broke Germany, Hitler said, was Patton's refusal to let defeat feel orderly. Every German retreat under Patton felt chaotic. Every fallback position felt temporary. There was never time to breathe, reorganize, or pretend control still existed. That constant pressure, Hitler explained, destroyed the illusion of structure that German command depended on. Once officers stopped believing their lines mattered, the entire system collapsed inward. Hitler became fixated on Patton's ability to compress time. Battles that German planners expected to unfold over weeks happened in days. Movements that should have required formal authorization occurred overnight. Hitler told his generals that Patton fought as if time itself were an enemy, and he attacked it relentlessly. This terrified Hitler more than encirclement or bombardment. Time was the one resource Germany no longer possessed. And Patton wasted none of it. Hitler also acknowledged, reluctantly, that Patton understood German psychology better than many German commanders still did. Patton did not aim for annihilation. He aimed for acceleration. He knew that if German units believed collapse was inevitable, they would make it real themselves. This was particularly evident, Hitler said, in Patton's handling of surrendered forces. Rather than slowing to process prisoners, Patton pushed forward, leaving the administrative burden behind him. This created the impression that resistance was pointless, because even surrender did not interrupt momentum. Hitler warned that Patton's greatest weapon was not aggression, but confidence. German units facing him felt as though they were already too late. Already behind. Already irrelevant. And once that belief took hold, discipline followed it into oblivion. There was also bitterness. Hitler accused his generals of trying to fight Patton with regulations, while Patton fought them with instinct. He claimed that the German command had become obsessed with justification, paperwork, approval, ideological consistency, while Patton simply asked one question: "Can I move right now?" If the answer was yes, he moved. If the answer was no, he moved anyway. Hitler contrasted this with his own command style, though he did not explicitly criticize himself. Instead, he framed it as tragedy. Germany, he said, had become too centralized, too rigid, too afraid of disorder. Patton thrived on disorder. He created it deliberately, then exploited it mercilessly. In one of the last recorded remarks about the American general, Hitler told his inner circle that Patton would not stop at victory. He said Patton would always be looking for the next movement, the next push, the next enemy. Victory, to Patton, was not an endpoint, it was fuel. This observation disturbed Hitler deeply, because it meant that Patton could never be satisfied, never be contained by success itself. While German generals sought stability, Patton sought motion. And motion, Hitler realized too late, was unstoppable once unleashed. As Soviet artillery thundered closer to Berlin, Hitler reportedly asked whether Patton had been ordered east. When told that Patton was being restrained by Allied politics and command agreements, Hitler scoffed. He said Patton did not need orders to advance, only opportunity. Even in his final days, Hitler believed Patton was capable of breaking agreements, outrunning diplomacy, and rewriting post-war boundaries simply by arriving first. That belief, whether accurate or not, revealed how deeply Patton had penetrated the German psyche. Patton had become the embodiment of American unpredictability. He represented a future Germany could not negotiate with, intimidate, or outlast. And in one of the most revealing moments of all, Hitler told his generals that if Germany had possessed even one commander like Patton in 1944, the war in the West would have unfolded very differently. It was not praise. It was a regret. By the time Hitler retreated fully into the bunker, the conversation about Patton ended, not because the threat was gone, but because there was nothing left to say. The warnings had come true. The momentum had broken Germany's spine. And Patton, without ever setting foot in Berlin, had helped make its fall inevitable. What Hitler told his generals about Patton before he died was not a plan. It was an admission. As the Third Reich collapsed in on itself, Hitler's final assessments of Patton grew darker, not with hatred, but with a kind of fatal clarity. By this stage, Patton was no longer discussed as a battlefield opponent. He was discussed as a phenomenon. A force that had exposed something Germany could not fix, even if the war had somehow continued. In one of the last fragmented conferences, Hitler told his remaining generals that Patton represented the end of an era in warfare. Not because he was the most brilliant tactician, or the most disciplined commander, but because he had broken the old rhythm of war. Patton didn't fight in phases. He fought in surges. And the German army, built around methodical sequencing, had no answer for that. Hitler admitted that German doctrine assumed pauses. Pauses to regroup. Pauses to resupply. Pauses to restore order. Patton denied those pauses. He treated momentum as a weapon and exhaustion as something to be inflicted, not avoided. Hitler said that Patton understood something Germany had forgotten. Soldiers could endure almost anything except uncertainty. Hunger could be managed. Fear could be disciplined. Losses could be rationalized. But not knowing where the enemy would strike next, or whether he would ever stop, destroyed morale faster than artillery. This was why Patton haunted German commanders even when he wasn't present. Hitler said Patton's absence often caused more panic than his presence. Units would hear rumors. Patton had crossed a river. Patton had bypassed a city. Patton had appeared somewhere impossible, and entire defensive plans would unravel before confirmation arrived. Hitler blamed this on what he called Patton's operational invisibility. Patton moved faster than intelligence. By the time German reconnaissance confirmed his position, it was already obsolete. Hitler said that Germany's obsession with accurate information became a liability against an enemy who thrived on speed rather than certainty. And then Hitler made one of his most telling remarks. He said Patton did not respect maps. German generals relied on maps as anchors, clear lines, defined objectives, tidy boundaries. Patton treated maps as suggestions. He trusted terrain, instinct, and opportunity more than geometry. Hitler told his generals that this made Patton dangerous not because he ignored planning, but because he replaced it with judgment. Judgment, Hitler warned, could not be predicted. As the conversation shifted to blame, Hitler accused his generals of trying to defeat Patton by anticipating him. He said Patton could not be anticipated, only reacted to, and even then, reaction came too late. Patton had already moved on. In a bitter twist, Hitler noted that Patton's aggression worked precisely because the Americans could afford it. Their industry, logistics, and manpower gave Patton permission to take risks that would have been suicidal for Germany. But rather than dismissing this as an unfair advantage, Hitler framed it as a missed opportunity. Germany, he said, had built weapons instead of momentum. Patton built momentum first, and let weapons catch up. Hitler admitted that German commanders still thought in terms of preserving forces. Patton thought in terms of expending pressure. The difference, Hitler concluded, was decisive. As Allied forces closed in from all directions, Hitler reportedly asked whether Patton had ever hesitated. Whether there had been a moment where Patton stopped, reassessed, or waited for approval. When told of Patton's repeated defiance of orders, his unauthorized advances, his refusal to slow, Hitler fell silent. Then he said something chilling. He said Patton reminded him of what German command used to be, before fear of failure overtook hunger for victory. That admission was rare. And devastating. At that moment, Hitler wasn't comparing Patton to Allied generals. He was comparing Patton to Germany's lost self-image, to the myth of decisive leadership Germany once believed it embodied. Hitler said Patton understood that war was not won by perfect execution, but by relentless initiative. That the side willing to act imperfectly, but continuously, would overwhelm a side paralyzed by correctness. As the bunker grew quieter and reports became more desperate, Hitler's references to Patton became less frequent. Not because Patton mattered less, but because Patton no longer needed explanation. The outcome was obvious. Patton had turned Western Europe into a moving front. There were no stable lines left to hold. No pauses left to exploit. Germany was reacting everywhere and controlling nowhere. In one of the final comments attributed to Hitler before his isolation deepened, he told a subordinate that Patton was the kind of enemy you defeat early, or not at all. Once unleashed, Patton could not be slowed, only delayed. And delay, Hitler admitted, was no longer enough. By then, The war was functionally over. Berlin was encircled. The Reich was collapsing. And Patton, alive, advancing, restless, represented the future Germany would never see. Hitler's words about Patton were never meant to survive. They were not propaganda. Not speeches. Not public statements. They were confessions. And they revealed a truth Hitler could no longer escape. Germany had not been beaten solely by numbers, technology, or even strategy. It had been beaten by a commander who refused to stop moving. In the final days before his death, Hitler's references to Patton ceased almost entirely. Not because Patton had vanished from the battlefield, but because Patton no longer needed to be explained. He had become the outcome itself. By April 1945, Patton's Third Army was no longer advancing through Europe in the traditional sense. It was unraveling Germany. Cities fell not after sieges, but after sudden appearances. German units surrendered not after defeat, but after realizing resistance had become meaningless. Patton's reputation now arrived before his tanks did, and that reputation carried more weight than artillery. Hitler understood this too late. According to those present in the bunker, Hitler spoke once more about Patton in a quiet, almost reflective tone. He said that Patton was not dangerous because he was reckless, but because he understood something German leadership had forgotten under layers of ideology and fear. War, Hitler said, was not about control. It was about initiative. Germany had built a system obsessed with obedience, precision, and authorization. Every movement required approval. Every deviation demanded justification. Patton inverted that logic entirely. He acted first, justified later, or not at all. And in doing so, he seized something Germany had surrendered long before the war's final year, time. Hitler admitted that Germany had lost the war minute by minute before it lost it mile by mile. Patton stole those minutes relentlessly. German generals tried to explain Patton as an exception, an outlier, an anomaly. Hitler rejected that framing. He said Patton was not exceptional because of personality, but because of permission. The American system allowed Patton to fail forward, to make mistakes without ending his career, to push boundaries without fear of execution or disgrace. That freedom, Hitler said, was decisive. In contrast, German commanders hesitated not because they lacked courage, but because they understood the consequences of being wrong. Patton's commanders understood the consequences of being slow. And speed, Hitler admitted, had become the deadliest weapon on the battlefield. As the war collapsed around him, Hitler reportedly asked whether Patton would turn east if allowed. Whether he would continue beyond Germany if the opportunity arose. The question wasn't strategic, it was psychological. Hitler wanted to know whether Patton had limits. Those around him didn't answer. Because by then, everyone understood the truth. Patton's limit was not geography. It was politics. And politics, not battlefield resistance, was the only thing that had ever slowed him. That realization disturbed Hitler more than defeat itself. It meant Germany hadn't been overpowered. It had been outpaced. In the final weeks, Hitler spoke often about betrayal, conspiracies, and disloyalty. But when Patton's name resurfaced, it was never in that context. Patton was never accused of cheating, cowardice, or deception. Instead, Hitler called him inevitable. A force that emerges when systems grow rigid and leaders forget how to move. That may have been Hitler's most honest admission of all. Because Patton represented everything Germany once claimed to admire: decisiveness, aggression, audacity. But Patton wielded those traits without ideology, without dogma, without fear of being wrong. And that made him unstoppable. When Hitler finally retreated fully into isolation, Patton continued advancing. When Hitler stopped issuing orders, Patton kept giving them. When Hitler surrendered to paralysis, Patton surrendered to nothing. The contrast was absolute. After Hitler's death, German officers who survived would later admit that Patton had become a symbol, not of American power, but of what modern war had become. Fast, unforgiving, relentless, driven by momentum rather than perfection. They said Patton didn't just defeat German armies. He defeated German thinking. And perhaps that is why Hitler's final words about Patton were not insults, but warnings. Warnings his generals could no longer act on. Warnings history would be remembered too late. Because Patton did not wait for it to collapse. He caused it. And by the time Hitler understood that truth fully, there was nothing left to command. Nothing left to stop. Only the sound of an enemy who had never learned how to slow down.